All right, guys. So today I want to give you a brief summary of what we've been learning about for these past few days and what you've been reading in your book. And that is on the topic of carbon compounds. So we're now on to chapter 3, lesson 1, starting to take a look at some biochemistry. So let's get into it. Again, before we started this lesson, I had you guys copy these different vocabulary words into your notebook. Make sure that those words are there along with their definitions to help you out. So the first thing that we talked about is the difference between what is an organic compound and what is an inorganic compound. And to take it even one step back, what is a compound? So just as a reminder, we have a few different ways that we can organize matter in the universe. The most simple form is an atom, which is one unit of an element. But when we chemically bond or join two or more atoms together, that creates a molecule or a compound. So here we're dividing all the compounds on Earth into two categories: organic compounds and inorganic compounds. So organic compounds on the whole are made mostly of carbon atoms. What we call that is a carbon backbone. So the majority of the atoms in that molecule are made of carbon. And one example is glucose, which we've talked about in the past. That is a product for photosynthesis and also a sugar that we use in our own bodies. So on the other hand, we have inorganic compounds. And on the whole, these do not contain carbon. There are some exceptions. Carbon dioxide is one, CO2 and carbon monoxide is another. But an example of an inorganic compound would be table salt. It includes sodium, Na, and chloride, or chlorine, Cl, but no carbon in there. So it is a compound made of atoms that are not carbon. And talking a little bit more about carbon, why is it so important? So back on Monday, I had you guys watch a brief video about why carbon is considered to be the building block for life. When we're talking about living things and organic chemistry, it's really the study of these molecules that are made mostly of carbon that create the living things that we see on Earth: plants, animals, fungi. And let's talk about why carbon is so important and why we are able to use carbon and see carbon in so many of these biomolecules. So thinking back to what we learned in the very first lesson, carbon, its atomic number is 6. So that means in the first orbital, it has its 2 electrons, nice and close to the nucleus. And then in the outer shell, it has 4 electrons, making a total of 6. Carbon is happy when it has 8 electrons in its outer shell. So how does it get those? It shares electrons with other atoms by forming covalent bonds. So remember, covalent bonds occur when 2 atoms are connected together. They're joined by the sharing of electrons. So here we have a bond with 2 electrons, one coming from hydrogen and one from carbon. And that happens at 4 points around the carbon atom. So the fact that carbon wants 4 electrons to be happy makes it very, very handy for bonding with other atoms. It could be something as simple as hydrogen making CH4, so this is methane, but we can also use those electrons or that need for electrons to bond carbon to other carbon atoms or a few other atoms that we'll see in organic compounds other than carbon. So let's take a look at that. So when we're building these molecules with carbon, they can be very simple, like methane, CH4, 1 carbon, 4 hydrogen atoms, and that's it. But we can also get much more complex structures and shapes, making these really big biomolecules or macromolecules. And they can come in a few different shapes. So here we have a ring. Here we have a straight carbon chain. So we can see just one line of carbons with other atoms. Here it's hydrogen connected to them. And we can also make these things called branched carbon chains. So here we have a straight carbon chain, but instead of continuing out this side, we have a branch coming off, and this carbon is actually connected down to this guy instead of being connected to a hydrogen. Another thing that you're going to see when we're looking at these bigger carbon compounds is that we don't only use single bonds. You guys will see some double bonds like this and even triple bonds. And the reason that's okay, let's take a look over here, is that, again, carbon wants to have a full outer shell. It has 4 electrons and it wants 4 more. So it can get that through a single bond. So here, this carbon atom is getting 1 electron from this carbon, 1 electron from this hydrogen. And here, since it's a double bond, these 2 carbon atoms, instead of sharing 1 electron, they're actually sharing 2. So that is how we get the total of 4 on this carbon. So it's still happy, even though it's only technically connected to 3 different atoms. So again, carbon compounds can come in a few different shapes: rings, straight chains, and a branched carbon chain. Think of a tree. All right, in these carbon molecules, you don't only find carbon and hydrogen, although that is mostly what I'm showing you here. There are some other atoms like nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus that we can see in these atoms as well. And I know this is a long paragraph, but I think it does a really good job of explaining this next piece. So basically, when we're talking about biological molecules, let's read through here. Large biological molecules are usually made up of a carbon skeleton. So that is the backbone, like we saw in the last slide. Chains or rings of carbon and hydrogen. But we can also add some other atoms, like oxygen, nitrogen, or sulfur. So often these extra atoms appear in the context of functional groups. So functional groups are the extra atoms that come together in a specific pattern. So that's why we call it a chemical motif, or a pattern of atoms that gives a certain function to the molecule. Let's take a step back and translate what that means. So in carbon molecules, again, there are a lot of different functional groups that we can connect onto our carbon backbone. And each of these functional groups is important because it gives the molecule specific characteristics. Maybe it can react with certain other molecules. Maybe it can dissolve certain other molecules or be dissolved. So these functional groups, these extra atoms in the specific pattern that they are, can help to impact what a molecule can do. For example, this hydroxyl group here, OH, if I have just a regular carbon chain and I add an OH, that makes this into what's called an alcohol. So it is a polar molecule. It can mix with water. That lends us more information about what its characteristics are because of this functional group. So just remember, functional determines function. The group determines what the job of this molecule is or what it can do. functional determines function. Okay, so the next thing that I want to explain is how these big molecules are formed and what all of those pieces are called. So we're talking about carbon chains, and then we're talking about functional groups, and now we have these other words, monomers and polymers. So to put all of this into context, a big molecule is called a polymer. We also call these macromolecules, one large molecule. But in order to make these big molecules, they're made up of many smaller molecules, smaller pieces, and those are called monomers. So when we're talking about really big carbon molecules, we can see a large molecule and break it down into smaller pieces that are called monomers. And here is an example. So here we have two monomers. These are molecules in and of themselves, but they're not too big. They're smaller pieces, smaller molecules. But these two smaller molecules, glucose and fructose, can combine together to make a bigger molecule, a polymer. So when we have two smaller molecules, these monomers, they combine together to make a polymer in a process called a condensation reaction. So in order for these two guys to bond and connect together, we need to get rid of something so that they can join. And what we get rid of is water. So from this carbon, we take off an OH. From this carbon, we take off an H. H2O. Two hydrogens, one oxygen. So when we connect these two guys together into sucrose, we kick out the water, and we are left with a bigger molecule, a polymer. And the way that you can remember this is by thinking about condensation on a mirror. So after you take a shower and you walk back into the bathroom and you look at the mirror, it's usually foggy and there's water vapor there and you have to wipe it off so that you can see your reflection. That water, that condensation, will help you to remember this type of reaction. So a condensation reaction, we take two monomers, we kick out a water, and we connect them to make a polymer. So that's one reaction that we can have between monomers and polymers. So that's to make bigger molecules. But what if we want to break these bigger molecules down? We just have to do the opposite. Instead of taking away water or kicking it out, we're going to add it back in. So here we have a polymer, ester, and we have our water. So what the water is going to do is wiggle its way in between the two monomers in this polymer so that we can break them into two smaller pieces, two separate monomers. And this process is called hydrolysis. So water comes from hydro. Hydro means water. And lysis means to break. So here we're using water to break a polymer, a big molecule, into smaller molecules called monomers. So again, the opposite of a condensation reaction. Here, we're using water by taking it out to make a polymer. And here we're using water to break a polymer into two smaller monomers, two more simple molecules. So why are these processes important for our bodies? That comes to ATP. And you may remember ATP or hearing about ATP back in biology in 7th grade or maybe 9th grade. But ATP is a special molecule, adenosine triphosphate, that the body uses like a battery. So this molecule can store or release energy. That's why it's really important in our cells. So when we make this molecule, when we put these pieces together, forming molecules stores energy because energy is stored in these connections, in these bonds. But when we break molecules, that releases energy. And that's the type of energy that the body needs, for example, your cells, in order to do their job. So imagine you have this ATP in your cell. Your body needs energy. Your cell needs energy to do its job. How do we get this energy out of the molecule? Well, we are going to use our hydrolysis reaction. We are going to use water to break the polymer into monomers and release energy. So here we have our ATP, we have some water, and we are going to conduct a hydrolysis reaction. So what we're left with is a new monomer, ADP, and phosphate. So the important thing about this is that, one, we use the water to break this bond between this monomer and this monomer. But also, the energy that used to be in that bond is now released into the cell so that it can use it to grow, to divide, whatever it needs to do. So that release of energy is the important piece that we need to know for ATP and why we go through these hydrolysis reactions. All right, guys, so that is it for today. Let me just go through a quick review of the high points. So, organic compounds are made of mostly carbon, like glucose. Inorganic compounds do not have that much carbon in them. There are some exceptions, but usually they don't have any. Carbon is really important for forming these organic molecules because it wants to have a full outer shell and it can make 4 covalent bonds to do it. So it bonds very easily and it wants to form these covalent bonds. Carbon compounds can come in 3 different shapes. They can be a ring, a straight chain, or a branched chain. Off of these carbon backbones, we can connect different functional groups. So these are extra pieces that connect to the carbons and the hydrogens that give the molecules special characteristics or allow them to react in a certain way and do a certain job. Monomers are small molecules that connect to make polymers. Condensation reactions are used to make polymers. And hydrolysis reactions are used to take a polymer and break it down into smaller monomers. And that's mostly important in our body for the creation and breaking of ATP in order to store and release energy. So guys, that is it for today. Definitely let me know if you have questions. You can chat me or send me a message. And I hope that you have a great day.